From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! We're on the road in San Francisco.
The fight goes on. I am a believer firmly, and without struggle, there is no progress. Frederick Douglass used to say that, of course. It was true then, it's true now. You know, without struggle, there's nothing.
Mumia Abu-Jamal. Today, we bring you our exclusive interview from his jail cell on death row. But first, the man who blew the whistle on the Bush administration's secret domestic surveillance program, Thomas Tamm, worked as an attorney at the Justice Department when he leaked the story to the New York Times in 2004. Since then, the FBI has raided his house and seized his files. He still faces arrest. And the Obama administration faces a deadline today to act on whether it'll release 3 classified Bush administration memos that authorize the use of torture. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The New York Times is reporting recent National Security Agency domestic spying has gone beyond the broad legal limits established by Congress last year. The NSA, meanwhile, also reportedly attempted to wiretap a member of Congress without court approval on an overseas trip in 2005 or 2006. The plan was ultimately blocked amidst concerns about spying on a member of Congress. We'll have more on this story after headlines. The Obama administration's reportedly decided to censor portions of 3 secret Bush administration torture memos it had previously vowed to release. The Justice Department memos were written to give legal backing to the CIA's interrogations program. The Wall Street Journal's reporting the Obama administration will redact the prisoners' names as well as details on how particular techniques were used. The administration's expected to make the announcement later today under a court-imposed deadline in a case brought by the ACLU. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. In Spain, prosecutors are planning on asking a Spanish court to drop a criminal investigation into whether 6 Bush administration lawyers, including former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, violated international law by providing the legal framework to justify the Bush administration's use of torture at Guantanamo. Spanish law allows it to claim jurisdiction because 5 citizens or residents say they were tortured while imprisoned there. Earlier today, Spanish prosecutor Candido Conde-Pompid said the case has no merit because the Bush officials weren't physically present when the torture occurred. The suit could still go forward despite the prosecutor's stance. The presiding judge, Baltasar Garzón, pursued the case against former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet over prosecutors' advice. Former Bush administration official Richard Armitage has said he would have resigned had he known what he knows now about the torture committed on his watch. In an interview with Al Jazeera's Avi Lewis, Armitage admitted the Bush White House authorized forms of torture.
So when you knew that the administration of which you were a part was departing from the Geneva Conventions and sidelining them, why didn't you quit?
In hindsight, maybe I should have, but you won in those positions. You see how many more battles will you have. You maybe fool yourself. You say, well, how much worse would X, Y, or Z be if I weren't here?
Richard Armitage served as Deputy Secretary of State from 2001 to 2005. A former FBI interpreter is claiming she witnessed the beating of a suspect in the 1998 bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya. The unidentified interrogator says she became so upset by the interrogation that she fled from the room. The translator couldn't see the prisoner, but could hear him behind a partition. According to her account, the suspect, Mohammed al-Awali, begged her to ask the interrogators to stop beating him. Al-Awali later confessed to the bombing and was sentenced to life in prison. His lawyers have maintained his confession was coerced. The Obama administration has appointed a so-called border czar to oversee drug-related law enforcement along the U.S.-Mexico border. Alan Burson held a similar post under the Clinton administration. Speaking to reporters in El Paso, Texas, Burson vowed to cooperate with the Mexican government.
Tengamos una oportunidad ahora We now have an opportunity between the United States and Mexico to construct a foundation of cooperation that will result in benefits for the future of both sides of the border. I believe we have the opportunity, and we must act on it.
A U.S. Army sergeant has been convicted of murder for the murder of 4 bound and blindfolded Iraqi prisoners. The killings took place in Baghdad in 2007. The sergeant, John Hatley, was found guilty of conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. 2 other soldiers have already been convicted, and another 2 have pleaded guilty in the case. In Afghanistan, dozens of women were attacked earlier today as they tried to protest a recent law that legalizes rape within marriage. The law bans women from refusing to have sex with their husbands and also says they can only seek work, education, or medical care with their husband's permission. The women were pelted with stones as they gathered in the Afghan capital, Kabul. It was the 2nd straight day of protest against the law, following another protest on Wednesday. Venezuela says it'll again ask the U.S. for the extradition of the Cuban militant and former CIA operative Luis Posada. Posada is wanted in Cuba and Venezuela for a 1976 airliner bombing that killed all 73 people aboard. But the U.S. has harbored Posada and rejected calls for his extradition. Earlier this month, Posada was indicted on charges of lying about his role in several 1997 bombings at tourist areas and hotels in Cuba. The new charges mark the first time the U.S. government has formally acknowledged Posada's role in carrying out attacks. Venezuela says it'll present the renewed extradition request before the opening of tomorrow's Americas Summit in Trinidad and Tobago. In Florida, 4 jurors who acquitted an Egyptian student of explosives charges earlier this month have condemned a U.S. government attempt to deport him, apparently on the same allegations. Yusuf Megahed was arrested just 3 days after a Tampa jury found him not guilty of possessing explosives that could be used for building a destructive bomb or rocket. He's now being held in an immigration jail. Megahed is a legal permanent resident here in the United States. He's lived here since he was 11 years old with his family. In a statement, the jurors said government is putting Megahed in double jeopardy. They continue, quote, more troublesome is the government's seeming blatant disregard for the will of its own people. You can go to our website at democracynow.org for more on that story. In North Carolina, clashes broke out Tuesday night at a student protest against former Republican Congressmember Tom Tancredo at the University of North Carolina. Hundreds of protesters converged on a lecture hall where Tancredo was speaking on opposing education benefits for undocumented immigrants. The protesters disrupted Tancredo's speech and raised banners saying, "No dialogue with hate," and "No one is illegal." A new report says the number of violent hate groups in the U.S. has increased more than 34% since 2000. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, 926 groups were active last year, up from 602 9 years ago. The report comes on the heels of a warning from the Department of Homeland Security that right-wing extremist groups are gaining new recruits by exploiting fears about the economy and the election of the nation's first black president. Tax Day was Wednesday, and when it came, dozens of protests of varying political stripes were held. In several major cities, right-wing groups protested government spending in rallies modeled after the Boston Tea Party. In Washington, D.C., hundreds rallied near the White House.
I think it's time to let people know that we are upset with some of the spending that's going on. The amount of spending is just unheralded in the history of this country.
And I don't think that our elected officials are really listening to our views about what's going on and what we feel. They just want to follow what the administration is doing.
Protests were also held by opponents of government spending on the military and war. The National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee says protests and vigils were held in more than 20 states. And in housing news, new figures show the number of Americans facing the loss of their homes grew 24% in the first 3 months of this year. According to Realty Track, more than 800,000 homes received at least one foreclosure-related notice from January through March. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're on the road in San Francisco.